Now, the blurrings and circulations between these very different kinds of things, I'm obviously not saying that someone spitting at someone on the street and Jack Straw making his comment and the state legislature discussing the niqab are the same thing. I'm saying that there's important flows of social force that occur in these different debates that we need to be attentive to. But in these circulations, what matters is the way that it's not just about media representations, it's not just about perceptions, it's not about the demonization of discourse. It's what some people say, oh, Islamophobia is about discourse, it's mere discourse, it's about perceptions and so on. What we need to look at is acts of violence, and we need to look at the actual sort of thug on the street. And obviously we have the spectrum of manifestations of the targeting of Muslims that goes from denigration, as was spoken of this morning, vilification, to, of course, very real and severe vandalism, attacks on buildings, blighting people's lives, and physical violence, of course. Now, all of this is underpinned by the war on terror. There is a global aspect to the mobilization of the targeting of Muslims that we can't forget. If we mention race and class, if we mention the kinds of debates that go on, of course we are very attentive to the securitization agendas, we are very attentive to the curtailment of civil liberties, and we don't usually make the connections between that and the other kinds of more insidious forms of everyday racism and Islamophobia that go on. So the terror industry, the way that it presents, legitimates, gives platforms to experts, analysts, risk consultants, and so on, is connected to the franchising of the war on terror globally, so that states very conveniently turn the war on terror to iterate ways of dealing with the subversives locally. Every subversive in a nation state becomes an iteration of the war on terror. And that should remind us, should bring to mind very closely to anyone with long-term and historical memories, the way that counterinsurgencies in colonial conditions produced sets of knowledge and ways of understanding and dealing with Islam and Muslims that are certainly inform and should bring lessons to us about the construction of intelligence about Muslims, the way that intelligence gathering and interpretation occurred, how the very objects, Islam and Muslims, were produced through important collusions between social sciences and securitization, the constructions and attempts to reform Islam from within, to affect the balance of power within, to bring progressive forces to the fore, to isolate and establish what was Sufism from what was orthodoxy, playing Shias against Sunnis, all this. Surely the history of counterinsurgencies, the Algerian War, the devailing processes, all these kinds of things are not just things that have passed and have no bearing on the present. They are extremely important, both to how these wars are conducted and to how we can respond to them. Now, the most immediate form in which we encounter this tends to be in terms of intuitive, immediate forms of nativism, nationalism, and so on, which by their very expression in terms of language and tropes tend to be nation-based defense leagues of Englishness, whatever it may be. But we mustn't lose, of course, sight of the European dimension of both the rhetoric, Europeanness, Westernness that underpins these notions of Islam as the other, but also of securitization, of surveillance, of concrete policies, both in terms of immigration and of security at European and global level. So, in part, it's the reconfiguration of the political field and the very ground of politics that's at stake. And for that, we know Nira and so many others have done. Is that Aftabra still speaking today? She's an obviously amazing work in terms of looking at the question of how the whole field of identities and the linguistic turn, the cultural turn, these aren't just things that are happening in theory. These are things that informed and changed the ground. If we look back to Stuart Hall and new ethnicities and so on, there were very important shifts that were occurring in the way that universities and the higher education sector became more important in public debates. The fact is that minority voices got into universities. They started contending and contesting notions of the canon, notions of what counts as knowledge, notions of the relationship between knowledge and power, and so on. And of course, the popular, the visual, all these kinds of fields became the ground of contestation and representation. So we mustn't move from the sort of notion that it's just that Muslim identities have become affirmed. It's that the very ground on which representation, politics, and the relation between them has shifted that is important. Now, obviously, multiculturalism is one of the aspects in which that played very concretely in the relations between policy, government, financing, and these shifts that were occurring in theory as well as experientially in relation to identities and identity mobilizations. But to the core of our program and of our session is the question of where does faith come into this? And I'm not actually sure that I'm very happy with the term faith being the one that is used here. But what matters to me is that in part this is these are epistemological questions as well as institutional questions. Ethnicity being seen as primordial, and then faith being seen as something that is a Johnny-come-lately that comes later and is a matter of choice, is very problematic towards actually understanding the field that we're working on. And for this, we need to, the basic problem is this, and I suppose I can draw to a conclusion with this, that seeing faith as voluntary, as a matter of conscience and a private matter is part of the problem. Seeing faith as something that is inner, that is a personal experience, that if given public expression becomes inherently divisive because religion is exceptionally and intrinsically absolutist, irrational, of a different order from rational discourse, is part of the problem in constructing what is going on here. But more importantly, I think, and skipping over a lot, is the question of what is religion. Why is it taken for granted that we know what we're talking about when we're then going to talk about the separations between politics and religion, or the church and the state, and so on? So religion is, of course, no more nor less historically constructed than all the other categories. So when we talk about religion and politics have histories. They are their histories and the histories of their contestations and the sedimentations which result as a result of power and contestation that has brought us to the present. And the demarcation between religion and non-religion is itself something that is of shifting boundaries. There isn't something called religion that's always and ever existed, is transhistoric, and really you can either be part of it or out of it. It's reconfigured as part of the very kinds of other struggles that are going on about any social discourse, social formation, and social interaction. And so we come to the question of secularism. And the most important thing for me here is to move from the notion of secularism as either the decline in practice or the notion of differentiation between state and church relations, as if this was a very simple thing, because of course it isn't, and is historically variable as well as contemporarily so. But to move towards the kind of the anthropologist Tal al-Assad's position on secularism, which is to really see it as the secular mediates what are acceptable differences. It basically is the way by which the state regulates a space in which the differences that are acceptable can manifest themselves, and differences that are unacceptable are excluded in the first place. So the notion that the secular is some sort of neutral space in which we can all go and then debate in an open manner is part of the problem. We need to conceive of the space of the secular as a thickened state that's already a sedimentation of power relations, including over the very conceptualization of what is secular, what is religious, what is political, and what are the subjectivities that are constructed in the first place to be able to be acceptable to speak in that space. Secularism is about the disciplining of certain subjectivities and their acceptability for public space and acceptability. In the present moment, I think that anyone who's interested in anti-racism and in greater social justice for all cannot be blind to Islamophobia and the targeting of Muslims. And while we must continuously engage in internal critique and all forms of critique, the question is certainly not, are Muslims heterogeneous? Do they have plurality within them? Of course, every community, every group is open to contestation, diversity, and so on. But where does power lie? Where does marginality lie? And what is being used to oppress whom?
Thanks very much.